Hey guys, today we'll be talking about 5 chess opening traps against e4 for black. Just a quick note that in chess, there are countless possibilities and moves that exist. It is important to remember that your opponent may not play the exact lines or fall into the traps shown in this video. The purpose of this video is to illustrate common opening traps against the first move e4. So let's get started. The first trap that we're going to show is against the Italian game, where here we will play the move knight to d4, and this would be the Blackburn shilling gambit. The whole idea of this trap is we invite white to capture our pawn on e5 because our knight has just moved away from defending the square on e5. Of course, white can play a move like knight takes d4 or just castle, and that would just be a normal chess game. However, for most beginners and even intermediate players, white players who have never seen this trap before will most likely play knight takes e5 because they think you have just made a blunder by playing knight d4. Because now the knight on e5 threatens to capture our pawn on f7. So now we play the move queen to g5, again inviting white to capture on f7 either with the knight or the bishop. If white captures with the knight, he attacks our queen and our rook, but don't worry because now we play the move queen takes g2, attacking white's rook instead. If white captures our rook on h8, we just capture their rook on h1 with check, and the king is actually trapped because he has no moves, as our queen and our knight both control the squares around the king. The only move for white here in this position is to play bishop back to f1. Now we capture the pawn on e4 with check. And the only way for white to try and defend this position is by playing bishop to e2, blocking with the bishop because the king has no moves, and if he blocks with the queen, we can just capture the queen. So after bishop e2, now we play this really nice move with pawn to d5. The whole idea of this move is we want to bring out our bishop and actually give checkmate in the next two moves. So for example, if white plays a move like pawn to d3, trying to attack our queen and bringing his own bishop out, now we have knight to f3 check. The bishop cannot capture because the king is in pin. So the king can't run to d2 as well because our knight covers that square. The only move for the king is to play king to f1, and now we see the idea of moving our pawn to d5 earlier on, freeing up our bishop on c8 to play this bishop h3 checkmate. We also have to go back and discuss what if white doesn't capture our rook on h8 and he tries to play rook to f1 instead to protect his rook. Now we play the move queen takes e4 check. Again, if queen e2, we just capture the queen. The only move for white is to block with the bishop, and knight to f3 is actually checkmate, and we get a nice smothered mate over here because again the bishop can't capture due to the king being in pin. So those were the lines for white that went knight takes f7, and now we have to discuss what if white plays the move bishop takes f7 as well. So after bishop takes f7 with check, we just have to move the king to the side, and the white's knight is still under attack, and the pawn on g2 is under attack as well. If white plays a move like bishop takes g8, capturing our knight and threatening to go knight to f7, checking our king and double attacking our queen. At the same time, we play the same idea, queen takes g2, attacking the rook. If he goes rook to f1, we play queen takes e4, and it's just checkmate on the next move. So this is a really nice first trap for the Blackburn shilling gambit against the Italian game. But before we continue with the other opening traps, if you're enjoying the content so far and want to see more videos like this, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support is what allows us to keep creating more amazing chess content for you. Alright, now let's discuss the second trap in the Italian game, but this time we do not play the move knight to d4 as we discussed earlier. Instead, we play the common move knight to f6 here, and if white plays the move knight to g5, which is the fright lever attack, threatening to capture on f7, now we play the move pawn to d5. There's actually another trap here in this variation where we can play bishop to c5, which would be the Traxler counter attack, and this move is already covered in one of our previous videos on destroy the fright liver attack and win in 7 moves. So check that video out if you're interested in learning how to play the Traxler counter attack. However, for this video, we'll be discussing the move pawn to d5, and after captures, now we play the move knight to a5, which is the Polario defense or the Polario variation. So here the most common continuation is to play bishop to b5 check, and after pawn to c6, we sacrifice one more pawn. After captures, white is now currently 1 pawn up, and the most aggressive continuation for white here is to play the move queen to f3, attacking our pawn on c6 as we only have one defender with the knight. So here, instead of defending the pawn on c6, we actually play the move bishop to e7, inviting white to capture the pawn on c6, sacrificing one more pawn. After white captures, we recapture with the knight, queen takes. Now we have to play the move bishop d7 because the queen is giving check and attacking our rook on a8 at the same time. So bishop d7 blocks the check, and now our queen protects our rook. So let's say white retreats the queen to the original square with queen to f3. Now we just castle, and after castle, even though as black we are now 2 pawns down, we have a significant compensation in our position. This is because we have the strong double bishop pair, and as you guys can see in the next few moves, we have lots of open lines to attack the white's position. And also, white's bishop and knight is undeveloped yet, and it would take them at least 3 more moves to bring their pieces out. So we cannot allow white those moves to develop their pieces because we are already 2 pawns down. And we start by playing the move knight to g4, attacking the white's knight on g5. The knight can retreat to h3 of course, but if he retreats the knight to h3, the knight here is actually trapped on the edge of the board where there's no squares to go. So white will most likely play the move knight to e4. Now we continue our pressure and attack the white's pieces with pawn to f5. Let's say the knight retreats this way, because if the knight goes back this way instead, it would just block his own knight on b1 from developing. So knight to g3, we keep up the aggression with pawn to e4, attacking the queen. Let's say white plays the move queen to b3 check, trying to gain a tempo because after king h8, he can develop with either knight to c3 or let's say pawn to d3. So after pawn to d3, now we play this key move, pawn to e3, advancing our pawn and actually sacrificing one more pawn. If white takes with the bishop, we just play pawn to f4 and we gain a piece because we just fork the white's knight and bishop. So white will most likely capture with the pawn instead. And now we play the move pawn to f4, sacrificing yet another pawn. After captures, we are now down 4 pawns, but again, look at the position. The white's king is exposed along this diagonal, and as mentioned earlier, now our bishop pair becomes really dangerous attackers, and white's pieces are still undeveloped on the queen side even though he's 4 pawns up. After a move like bishop to c5 check, the only move for white is to hide the king in the corner, king to h1, and after queen to h4, this is just completely winning for black already because we threaten to capture on h2 with checkmate and there's no defense in this position. As you guys can see, the evaluation bar shows m3, which is checkmate in 3 moves for black. Next, we will be moving on to show 2 traps in the Scandinavian defense. So the first trap is after e4 d5, captures. We do not hurry to capture back with the queen, but instead we play the move knight to f6 because we want to capture back with the knight instead. If white plays the move knight to c3, we just capture back with the knight, and after knight takes, queen takes, pawn to d4, very common moves for white in this position, knight to c6, knight to f3, and now the main line here goes bishop to g4 as black, but here the trap is we play the move knight to b4, which may seem like an odd looking move. The knight is looking to capture the pawn on a2, but that is not the idea of this trap. The idea of this trap is the move knight to b4 actually attacks the pawn on c2. So on the next move, we're threatening to go queen to e4 check, attacking the king, and then following up with knight takes c2 check, winning the rook on the next move. And here there's actually not much good moves that white can play. Of course, he can play a move like bishop to d3, and if he plays that move, we can just chop off the bishop with the knight. And after queen takes, black is very happy with this position because we have this double bishop now. We can develop the bishop here to f5, we can move the bishop to g4, or we can even develop the bishop this way with b6 and bishop b7, controlling this whole diagonal. So if white doesn't see the trap and plays a move like pawn to c3, attacking the knight, now we play the move queen to e4 check, going knight to c2 on the next move. If he blocks with the bishop, like let's say bishop e3, we just give check, and we win the rook on the next move. Similarly, if he blocks with this bishop instead, we give check again. After king moves to the side, we just capture the rook, and we're easily one rook up. So the best move for white in this position according to the engine is actually to play this insane move with king to d2, moving the king away from the check and protecting the square on c2, not allowing our knight to jump because the queen and the king now protects this square. So this is actually a crazy defensive resource that's the best move according to the engine. And here, actually, you can go for perpetual check for a draw with queen to f4 check and just repeating moves if, let's say, you're playing against a stronger or higher rated opponent. But if you like to push ahead and go for the win, we will recommend you guys to play the move pawn to e6. The whole idea of this move is white cannot recapture the knight because you just play bishop takes b4 and it's just checkmate. So the best reply for white in this position is to play bishop to b5 check according to the engine, and after a move like c6, bishop back, bishop e7. Again, white can't capture because bishop captures is just checkmate. a3, knight to d5, and even though the engine gives white in this position with a slight edge of 0.3 or 0.4, as you guys can look at this position, the king is stuck at the center of the board. It can't castle, it blocks its own bishop from development, and black, you have no problems in this position. So you have at least a perpetual check here with queen to f4 and queen to e4 check, achieving at least a draw. And if you like to continue to push for the win, the move would be pawn to e6 so that you can recapture the knight. With the bishop to give checkmate. Now let's move on to trap number 4. And earlier on we discussed what if white plays the move knight to c3. So now we see what if white plays the move pawn to d4, which is another common variation in the Scandinavian defense. Now we play the move bishop to g4, inviting white to play the move pawn to f3, which is the most common variation in this line. Because after we retreat the bishop, now white can actually play the move pawn to c4, protecting the d5 pawn, and at first glance, white's center pawns over here actually look quite strong and solid. But now we play the move pawn to e6, which is the Portuguese variation in the Scandinavian defense, and after pawn captures, we play the move knight to c6. So essentially, we give up yet another pawn. The whole idea of this variation is if white captures again on f7, we actually like that move because after king takes, our king is in no danger because there's no checks on our king. And if you take a look at white's position, all of white's pieces are still stuck on the first rank. Whereas as black, we have already developed 3 pieces. Even though we gave up 2 pawns, we are threatening to capture the pawn on d4 right now. So let's say white plays a move like bishop to e3, which is very common, trying to defend the pawn on d4. Now we play bishop to b4 check, developing yet another piece. After knight to c3, now we see the whole idea of inviting white to capture our pawn on f7. And even though that forces us to recapture with the king, we see the whole idea of this variation, this Portuguese variation, as we can free up the e8 square for our rook to play rook to e8, pinning the bishop to the king. And as mentioned earlier, just look at black's pieces. Almost all of black's pieces is already developed, and white is in serious trouble now because the king is exposed in the center and his pieces are severely undeveloped. So here white actually has 2 options. He can play king to f2 or queen to d2, protecting the bishop. let's take a look at what if white plays the move king to f2. For those Scandinavian players, you probably know, who is also familiar in the Portuguese variation, you probably already know what's the move here and what's the combination here for black. But for those of you who have not seen this position before, take some time and try to figure out the best move for black in this position. Pause the video and take a few minutes to try and find the best move. The best move here is to play this amazing sacrifice with rook takes e3, sacrificing the rook for the bishop. This draws the king out further, because after king takes e3, now here comes another aggressive sacrifice blow with bishop to c2, attacking the queen. The bishop obviously can be captured, but if white captures, now that leaves the d4 pawn undefended, and we can capture back with the queen. Queen takes d4 check. The only move for white is to retreat to king to e2, and now rook to d8 check. We bring in our last attacking piece into the game, and black's king has no moves. He has to defend the check by blocking it with the knight, and after captures, queen captures, this is just completely winning for black already. The king is stuck in the center of the board. He will most likely have to recapture back with the queen, giving up his queen, and his pieces are still undeveloped. So if white ignores the bishop and plays queen to d2 instead, trying to protect the pawn. Now, again, pause the video if you'd like to find the next series of combination for black. The move now is knight to g4, sacrificing yet another piece, because after pawn takes, queen to g5 check. If the king goes to the left, over here, that will just leave the queen undefended. So after king to e2, again, rook to e8 check. The king can't move to the side. He has to move to the left, and that would just give up the queen, and this is easily won for black. Alright, so that's the tactical fireworks for what if white plays king to f2. We still need to discuss what if white plays queen to d2 instead, protecting his bishop with the queen. Now, we can play the move queen takes d4, because the bishop cannot recapture as it's in pin. And now, as black, we threaten to capture the bishop on e3 with our queen and our rook. And let's say white plays queen takes d4, we just recapture with the knight. Again, he can't capture our knight due to the pin on his king, and this position is actually very hard and very difficult for white already, because the bishop is under attack, and knight to c2 check, attacking the rook and attacking the bishop as well, is coming on the next move. Now, last but not least, we have shown two traps for e4, e5, two traps for e4, d5, the Scandinavian defense, and our last trap would be for the Sicilian defense. However, this will only work if your opponent plays the move d4, takes, and c3, which is the Smith-Morra gambit. Now, of course, the Sicilian defense is the most complicated opening in chess, and white can play the usual knight to f3, knight to c3, or any other moves. So this trap only works if your opponent plays pawn to d4, and after captures, he plays pawn to c3, which should lead us to the Smith-Morra gambit, and we actually accept this gambit by capturing yet another pawn. So after knight takes, the situation is kind of reversed now, in the sense that we accept white's gambit, because in the previous four examples that we've shown, we as black are actually the ones giving up the pawns and playing the gambits ourselves. So here, after some normal opening moves, we get to this position over here, where after queen to e2, another normal move, we play this odd looking move with knight to g1.